She arrived at the city auditorium earlier than expected, holding her music folder close to her chest. The building felt larger and quieter than usual, because rehearsals had not yet begun, and the wide wooden floor reflected the soft lights above. Her name was Alina, and she had been invited to perform at a charity recital, something she had worked toward for many years. Music had always been her steady companion, especially after life had changed suddenly and painfully. She walked slowly across the stage, breathing in the familiar smell of wood and polish, reminding herself to stay calm and focused. Alina had grown up in a small town where life was simple and close-knit. She and her younger brother Daniel shared everything growing up, including a small upright piano. Their parents bought secondhand. The keys were worn and uneven, but to them it felt like magic. Their evenings were filled with music, laughter, and dreams, until the day everything shifted. A sudden accident took their parents and left the siblings separated by circumstances neither of them could control. Alina was sent to live with an aunt in another city, while Daniel was placed with distant relatives, and contact slowly faded despite promises to stay close. Music became Alina's way of surviving the loneliness that followed. She practiced relentlessly, not because she wanted applause, but because the piano was the one place where memories felt alive rather than painful. She learned discipline, patience, and emotional control through sound. Every piece she played carried a part of her past. Even when she performed for strangers, she rarely spoke about her family, and never mentioned her brother because the absence still felt too heavy to explain. The invitation to perform at the recital came unexpectedly. Her teacher encouraged her, saying it was a chance to be heard, and to honor the work she had put in. Alina agreed, though she felt nervous, not about playing, but about standing in a space that demanded vulnerability. She prepared carefully, choosing a piece that reflected calm strength and quiet emotion. She did not know who would be in the audience, and she did not expect anything beyond completing the performance with honesty. As she walked toward the piano on stage, she noticed movement near the front row, someone standing slightly apart from the others. Her heart skipped, but she dismissed the feeling as nerves. She sat at the bench, adjusted her posture, and placed her hands lightly on the keys. She closed her eyes briefly to center herself, just as she had done countless times before. When she opened her eyes again, she glanced toward the audience, and that was when everything changed. Standing near the aisle was a man, watching her closely, his posture familiar, his expression uncertain, yet unmistakable. Alina's breath caught, and her fingers froze above the keys. The room seemed to narrow as her focus locked onto him. The shape of his face, the way he held his shoulders, even the slight scar near his eyebrow. It was Daniel, older than she remembered, but undeniably him. Her mind raced, trying to understand how he could be there after so many years without contact, without warning. She felt a rush of emotions: surprise, confusion, relief, and a deep ache she had learned to live with but never resolved. Daniel's eyes widened as he realized she had seen him, and in that moment years of silence collapsed into shared recognition. Neither of them moved, and the quiet of the auditorium felt charged with unspoken history. Alina stood slowly, unsure of what to do. The audience murmured softly, sensing something unexpected, but not knowing what it was. She took a step forward, then stopped, unsure if approaching him would break the fragile reality of the moment. Daniel nodded slightly, as if to reassure her that he was real, and that he was there on purpose. Later she would learn that Daniel had tracked her down. After seeing her name listed in the program, he had followed her journey quietly from a distance, unsure if she would want to see him after all this time. He came not to interrupt, but to witness, to reconnect in the only way he knew, through music. He remembered how she used to play for him in their childhood home, and how those moments had made everything feel safe. But in that moment on stage, Alina only knew that the past she had carried alone was suddenly standing in front of her. She returned to the piano bench slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at Daniel once more, then lowered her gaze to the keys. The audience grew quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. Alina took a deep breath and decided to play, not despite the surprise, but because of it. She began softly, allowing the music to guide her emotions rather than resist them. Each note carried memory, longing, and hope. The piano became a bridge between who she was and who she had been, and between her and the brother she thought she had lost. The sound filled the hall, steady and sincere, and for the first time in years, Alina felt that something broken had found a way to breathe again. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As the music continued to flow from Alina's hands, the initial shock slowly softened into focus. She let the rhythm steady her breathing, and allowed her fingers to move with the confidence built over years of practice. The audience remained silent, sensing that something deeply personal was unfolding, even if they did not understand it fully. Daniel stood still near the aisle, afraid that any movement might distract her, yet unable to look away. His presence no longer felt like an interruption, but like a quiet anchor grounding the moments. Alina chose not to look at him again right away. She knew that if she did, the emotions might overwhelm her. Instead, she poured everything she felt into the music: memories of shared laughter, childhood arguments, long afternoons at the piano, and nights when she wondered where he was, and if he was safe. Each phrase carried a question and an answer at the same time. The melody rose and fell with restraint, never dramatic, but deeply honest, and that sincerity reached the room. Daniel listened with his entire body. He recognized the way she shaped certain notes, the pauses she always took before transitions, the subtle emphasis that meant something only they had ever understood. He remembered sitting beside her as a boy, turning pages and pretending not to care, While secretly feeling proud, the music brought those moments back with such clarity that his chest tightened. He realized then how much he had missed, and how much had been left unsaid. In the audience, people leaned forward, some clasped their hands, others simply closed their eyes. The atmosphere felt heavier and warmer at the same time. The music was not loud or showy, but it held attention completely. Alina's posture relaxed. As she moved deeper into the piece, her fear slowly replaced by purpose. She was no longer playing for approval or perfection, she was playing to speak when words felt impossible. As the final section approached, she allowed the tempo to slow slightly, giving space for the sound to breathe. The hall felt suspended, as if time had paused. Her last notes lingered gently before fading into silence. And she held her hands on the keys for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what she had just shared. The applause began softly, then grew steady and full. People stood without prompting, moved by something they could not fully explain. Alina rose from the bench and finally looked toward Daniel. Their eyes met. And in that look there was recognition, relief, and a shared understanding that the moment was real. He nodded again, this time with a small smile, and she felt tears gather, but she held them back, choosing composure over collapse. After leaving the stage, Alina was guided backstage by the coordinator, who spoke quietly, praising her performance. Alina thanked her politely, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Moments later, Daniel appeared at the doorway, unsure if he was welcome. She looked up, and for a second neither of them spoke. The years between them felt present, but less heavy than before. She took the first step, closing the distance, and they stood facing each other, close enough to see how time had shaped them. Daniel looked older, more reserved, but his eyes were the same. She reached out and touched his arm as if to confirm he was real, and he nodded again. His voice caught when he spoke her name, and she felt the last of her restraint slip away. They spoke quietly at first, exchanging simple words, asking how are you and are you okay, questions that carried far more than they seemed. They moved to a quiet corner of the backstage area, away from noise and attention. Daniel explained that he had searched for her for years, but never knew how to reach her. He spoke of moving, often of responsibilities and missed chances. Alina listened without interruption, understanding how easily life could pull people apart despite intentions. She shared her own story of living with her aunt, of studying music, and of carrying guilt for not trying harder to find him earlier. They both acknowledged the pain without blame, recognizing that they had been children forced to navigate adult loss. The conversation felt careful, but honest, each word building trust rather than reopening wounds. Daniel told her that when he saw her name in the recital program, he knew he had to come, even if she chose not to see him. He said he wanted her to know that he had always believed in her music, and that hearing her play again reminded him of home. Alina listened with tears in her eyes, realizing how much they had both held inside. As the night came to a close, they stepped outside together into the cool air. The city lights felt different now, softer and more welcoming. They agreed not to rush anything, but to stay in touch, to rebuild slowly with patience and care. Alina felt a quiet sense of peace settle within her. The surprise that once threatened to overwhelm her had become an opening instead. She walked away from the auditorium that night knowing that the performance had changed more than just her confidence. It had reunited her with a part of her life she thought was gone. The piano had once again done what it always did best. It had spoken when words could not. And in doing so, it had brought two hearts back into the same moment, ready to move forward together again. In the days that followed, Alina and Daniel moved carefully, as if learning a familiar language again. They exchanged messages, at first simple and brief, checking in without pressure. Alina returned to her practice routine, but the music felt different now, carrying a sense of release she had not known before. The tightness she once felt when thinking of her past softened, and she found herself playing with more openness and ease. The piano no longer held only memory, it now carried possibility. Daniel stayed in the city longer than planned, finding reasons to remain nearby. He attended another rehearsal, quietly sitting in the back. This time Alina knew he was there, and the awareness gave her comfort rather than distraction. After the session, they walked together through nearby streets, talking about ordinary things such as work, daily habits, and favorite meals. These small details mattered, because they rebuilt connection without forcing emotion. They laughed once over a shared childhood habit, and the sound felt like proof that something intact still existed between them. They chose to meet in neutral spaces, cafes, parks, and public libraries, places that allowed conversation to unfold naturally. Daniel spoke about his years moving between households, learning to adapt quickly and taking on responsibility early. He described jobs he had taken and how music had remained a constant for him as well. Even though he never played, he said he listened often and thought of her whenever he heard a piano. Alina listened with care, realizing how parallel their lives had been despite distance. Alina shared her journey through formal training, performances, and moments of doubt. She admitted that she had sometimes avoided thinking about family because it felt easier than facing unanswered questions. Daniel did not take offense. He understood that silence had been a form of survival for both of them. Acknowledging this brought relief rather than pain. They agreed that neither had failed the other, life had simply moved faster than they could manage. One afternoon, Daniel asked if she would play for him alone. The request was gentle and unassuming. Alina hesitated briefly, then agreed she invited him to the practice room. She often used a quiet space with soft light and a well-worn piano. As she sat down, she felt a familiar flutter, but it passed quickly. She chose a piece they both remembered from childhood, something simple and melodic. When she began, Daniel closed his eyes and listened fully, letting the sound wash over him. When she finished, he did not speak right away. He simply nodded and smiled, saying that it felt like being home again. Those words stayed with Alina because they captured exactly what she had hoped music could do: not impress, not perform, but restore. She realized then that the piano had not only reunited them, it had given them a shared ground to stand on again. As they spent more time together, they established gentle boundaries, agreeing to let trust grow naturally, rather than trying to make up for lost years in a rush. They scheduled regular calls and occasional visits, building rhythm into their reconnection. Alina appreciated this approach because it allowed her to maintain focus on her work while nurturing the relationship. Daniel respected her dedication and never asked her to choose between music and family. The recital organizers reached out to Alina with feedback and future opportunities. She accepted some and declined others, feeling clearer about her direction. She noticed that her performances carried a new depth. Audiences responded warmly, and she felt more present on stage. She knew that part of this change came from resolving something internal that had once weighed her down. Daniel attended one more public performance, standing quietly at the back. Alina spotted him during intermission and felt a calm sense of support rather than pressure. After the performance, he congratulated her simply and thanked her for sharing the music. Alina realized how important it was that he saw her not only as a sister, but as an artist, and she felt respected in both roles. They also spoke about the future, discussing how to stay connected despite living in different places. They planned visits around meaningful moments rather than convenience, and agreed to keep communication honest even when life grew busy. This clarity reduced fear and allowed hope to settle without strain. Alina found herself reflecting on how the surprise of seeing Daniel had transformed into something steady in life. She no longer replayed the moment with shock. Instead, she remembered it as a turning point, where courage and openness had met. She understood that healing did not arrive all at once, but through consistent care and shared effort. Daniel expressed similar thoughts, saying that coming to the recital had been the hardest decision he had made in years, but also the most rewarding. He admitted that he had feared rejection more than anything else. Alina assured him that while the surprise had been overwhelming, it had also been a gift. They both agreed that the risk had been worth it. As weeks passed, the rhythm of their renewed connection settled into everyday life. Alina returned fully to her musical goals, carrying her past with more ease. Daniel resumed his responsibilities with a lighter heart, knowing he was no longer disconnected from the one person who shared his earliest memories. They did not seek to recreate what had been lost. Instead, they focused on what could be built now, grounded in honesty, patience, and mutual respect. The piano remained a bridge between them, a reminder that even after long silence, shared roots could still produce harmony. Alina understood that the moment she reached the stage and saw her brother had changed the direction of her story, not by erasing pain, but by allowing it to transform into connection and purpose. She moved forward knowing that family could be rebuilt slowly, and that music would continue to guide her not only as an art, but as a language of reunion and understanding. As time continued to move forward, Alina and Daniel began to understand that rebuilding a relationship required patience more than emotion. They resisted the urge to relive every lost year, and instead focused on learning who they were now. Alina noticed how Daniel listened carefully before speaking, and how he preferred simple plans and quiet spaces, while Daniel observed how disciplined her life had become, shaped by practice schedules, travel, and constant self-evaluation. These differences did not distance. Instead, they encouraged curiosity and respect. They decided to spend a full weekend together away from performances and responsibilities, choosing a small town near the coast where neither of them had history. The setting allowed them to talk freely without interruption. They walked along quiet streets, shared meals, and spoke late into the evening about their parents, not in dramatic detail, but through small memories that felt safe to share. They laughed at forgotten habits and acknowledged painful moments without assigning blame. This balance helped them feel closer without reopening wounds. Alina shared how music had often been her only anchor during difficult years, and Daniel admitted that listening to music had been his way of staying connected to her presence. Even when they were apart, he told her that whenever he felt lost, he imagined her playing the piano, and that image gave him direction. Alina listened with emotion, realizing how connected they had remained without knowing it. This understanding brought comfort and softened the regret she once carried. During the weekend, Daniel asked questions about her performances and training, not out of obligation but genuine interest. Alina appreciated this because it allowed her to speak openly about her ambitions and doubts. She admitted that she often feared losing herself in expectations, and that reconnecting with him reminded her why she began playing in the first place. Daniel responded by encouraging her to protect that original purpose rather than chase approval. His words carried weight because they came from shared history rather than outside judgment. When they returned to their separate routines, They stayed in consistent contact, not constant, but reliable short messages, calls at agreed times, and shared updates that respected each other's schedules. This rhythm created security without pressure. Alina noticed that her focus improved because she no longer carried unanswered questions. And Daniel felt more grounded knowing that the connection did not depend on constant reassurance. At her next major performance, Alina experienced a new kind of calm. She knew Daniel could not attend, yet she felt his support internally rather than visually. The music flowed with clarity and audiences responded warmly afterward. A fellow musician commented that her playing felt more centered. And Alina recognized that this change came from internal resolution. Rather than technique, she felt gratitude for the reunion without needing to make it the center of her identity. Daniel also experienced changes in his own life. He approached work and relationships with more openness and less guardedness. Reconnecting with Alina had reminded him that vulnerability did not always lead to loss. He shared this realization with her during one of their calls, and she listened carefully, proud of the growth they were both experiencing independently, yet together. They also spoke honestly about boundaries, agreeing that family connection did not mean obligation or constant presence. They allowed space for individual growth and trusted that shared roots would remain strong. This mutual respect prevented old fears from resurfacing and allowed the relationship to develop naturally rather than through expectation. One meaningful moment came when Daniel sent Alina a recording of himself humming a melody they used to play together. As children, the sound was imperfect and unpolished, but deeply sincere. Alina listened quietly and felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from recognition. She replied by sending him a short recording from the piano, shaping the melody gently into something whole. This exchange became a private ritual between them, a way of communicating without explanation. As months passed, Alina began mentoring younger musicians and found herself speaking about balance, identity, and emotional honesty without directly referencing her personal story. She realized that the reunion with her brother had influenced how she guided others, helping her emphasize resilience without isolation and ambition without disconnection. Daniel noticed this change and told her that she had become more herself rather than more accomplished, and that distinction mattered to him. They eventually returned together to their hometown, walking past familiar streets and the old house where they once lived. The visit was brief and respectful. They did not linger or attempt to recreate the past. Instead, they acknowledged what had been and honored how far they had come. This act of shared closure strengthened their bond and allowed them to move forward without carrying unresolved weight. Alina understood that the surprise of seeing her brother at the piano had not been a dramatic turning point, but a quiet realignment. It had brought her inner and outer worlds closer together and allowed her to live with greater honesty. She no longer feared that success would isolate her or that family would hold her back. She saw clearly now that connection and purpose could exist side by side. Daniel shared similar reflections, saying that seeing her on stage had reminded him that strength could be gentle and that perseverance often looked ordinary. These insights shaped how he approached his own future and strengthened his confidence in making thoughtful choices rather than reactive ones. Together, they built something new, not a replacement for what was lost, but a relationship grounded in mutual respect, patience, and shared memory. The piano remained a symbol between them, not of talent or performance, but of continuity, a reminder that even after long silence, harmony could return when both sides were willing to listen. Alina moved forward with renewed clarity, carrying her music into new spaces with less fear and more intention. She knew now that when she reached the piano, she was no longer alone in her history or her hope, and that knowledge gave her strength that no applause ever could. As Alina and Daniel continued building their renewed bond, they began to feel the quiet strength that comes from consistency. Rather than intensity, their connection no longer felt fragile or surprising. It felt steady, grounded, and real. They did not try to define it with labels or expectations. They simply showed up when they said they would, and listened when the other spoke. This reliability created a sense of safety that neither of them had known since childhood. Alina noticed how this stability began to influence her daily life. She approached practice with greater patience and less pressure. She no longer felt the need to prove herself through flawless performances. Instead, she focused on sincerity and emotional clarity. The piano responded to this shift. Her playing felt warmer, more intentional, and audiences sensed the difference even when they could not explain it. She felt proud not because she was improving, but because she was playing honestly. Daniel, on his side, experienced a similar change. He became more open in his relationships and more confident in his decisions. Reconnecting with Alina reminded him that parts of himself he thought were lost were simply waiting for acknowledgement. He began allowing himself to enjoy music again, attending small concerts and listening at home, not as a reminder of absence, but as a source of grounding. He shared these moments with Alina, and she appreciated how music continued to serve as a shared language between them. They agreed to create a small tradition, meeting once every few months in a place that felt neutral and peaceful. Sometimes it was a park, sometimes a quiet town neither had visited before. These meetings were not filled with heavy conversation. They walked, talked, ate simply, and allowed silence when it felt natural. This rhythm helped them maintain closeness without overwhelming the balance they had worked hard to create. One such meeting took place before an important performance for Alina. She felt nervous not because of the audience, but because the piece she planned to play carried deep personal meaning. Daniel listened as she explained her concerns and asked thoughtful questions without offering solutions. His presence alone helped her steady her thoughts and clarify her intention. She realized then that support did not require advice, it required attention. At the performance, Daniel sat among the audience, not hidden and not highlighted. Alina knew he was there and felt a quiet confidence rather than pressure. When she played, she allowed herself to be vulnerable without fear of losing control. The music carried memory, resilience, and acceptance. And when she finished, the applause felt secondary to the sense of alignment she experienced. Daniel met her afterward and simply said that the music sounded like her. Those words meant more to her than any formal praise. As opportunities continued to come, Alina became more selective. She declined performances that felt rushed or disconnected from her values, choosing instead those that allowed depth and preparation. Daniel supported these decisions even when they meant slower progress. He reminded her that the path she was building needed to feel livable, not impressive. His perspective helped her resist external pressure and stay grounded in purpose. They also began talking more openly about the past, not to dwell on it, but to understand it better. They shared memories of confusion and loneliness, and acknowledged how both had felt responsible for staying strong too early. These conversations were careful and honest, and they helped release unspoken guilt. Neither of them blamed the other. They recognized that they had been children navigating loss without guidance. This shared understanding softened long-held tension and replaced it with compassion. Alina noticed that she was no longer avoiding certain memories or emotions. When she played the piano, she allowed sadness, joy, and nostalgia to exist together without fear. This emotional range enriched her music and deepened her connection with listeners. She understood now that the piano was not only an instrument, but a place where integration could happen, where different parts of her life could coexist without conflict. Daniel expressed similar growth. He said that hearing her play now felt different because it reflected a fuller version of her, and in turn helped him feel more complete. He began writing, occasionally journaling his thoughts, and sharing some with Alina. These exchanges deepened their understanding and created another layer of connection beyond shared history. As months passed, their bond felt less like a reunion and more like a relationship that had always existed, simply paused by circumstance. They no longer measured time by years apart, but by moments shared. Now, this shift allowed them to move forward without carrying the weight of comparison or regret. Alina reflected often on how unexpected the encounter at the piano had been and how gently it had reshaped her life. She did not see it as destiny or coincidence, but as a moment where openness met courage. She understood that if either of them had chosen silence instead, the opportunity might have passed unnoticed. This awareness strengthened her commitment to staying receptive to life, even when uncertainty felt uncomfortable. Daniel shared that same belief, saying that showing up that day had been an act of fear as much as hope, and that the reward came not from immediate reunion, but from the slow rebuilding that followed. They both agreed that the most meaningful changes often unfolded quietly over time rather than in dramatic moments. Together, they continued forward, not as replacements for what had been lost, but as individuals choosing connection with intention. The piano remained a symbol between them, not of talent or performance, but of listening and presence. It represented the place where honesty began and where reunion found its voice. Alina felt grateful that her journey with music had led her back to family, not by force, but by resonance. She moved ahead with clarity, knowing that whatever stages she stood on next, she would carry with her a grounded sense of self, strengthened by restored connection and quiet understanding. As Alina moved into this next stage of her life, she felt a deeper sense of calm that did not depend on success or approval. Her days felt fuller yet lighter, because she no longer carried unresolved weight from the past. The reunion with Daniel had settled into something steady and dependable, and that steadiness gave her room to grow without fear. She practiced daily, but with a different intention, focusing on clarity and expression rather than perfection. The piano felt less like a test and more companion that understood her pace. Daniel noticed these changes even from a distance. Their conversations became more reflective and less cautious. He spoke about his own life with greater honesty, sharing uncertainties about work, relationships, and direction. Alina listened without trying to guide him, and he appreciated that she treated his thoughts with the same care she gave to music. This mutual respect deepened their bond and allowed both of them to feel seen without pressure to perform a role. During this time, Alina was invited to collaborate on a small project involving young musicians from difficult backgrounds. The idea was to create a simple recital that emphasized emotional expression rather than technical achievement. She agreed immediately because the project aligned with what she had learned through her own journey. She spent time mentoring the students, encouraging them to connect with the music personally rather than trying to impress an audience. She shared parts of her story, not in detail. Reassurance that uncertainty and loss did not disqualify anyone from creating something meaningful. Daniel attended one of the rehearsals, quietly sitting near the back. He watched Alina work with patience, warmth, and authority without dominance. He later told her that seeing her in that role made him realize how much strength she carried without needing to display it. His words stayed with her because they reflected a truth she was still learning to accept about herself, that leadership could be gentle and still powerful. As the recital approached, Alina felt a familiar nervousness, but it was softer and more manageable. Daniel offered to help in small ways, organizing programs, moving chairs, and supporting the students. His involvement felt natural and unforced, and Alina appreciated how easily they worked together. It reminded her of childhood moments when they shared responsibility without discussion. The rhythm returned effortlessly, as if it had never been lost. The day of the recital arrived quietly, without spectacle. The students performed with sincerity and courage, and the audience responded warmly. Alina played a short piece at the end, not as a feature, but as a closing gesture. The music felt reflective and open, and when it ended, there was a sense of shared accomplishment rather than applause-driven excitement. Daniel watched from the side, feeling proud not only of her playing, but of the space she had created for others. After the event, Alina and Daniel sat together in the empty hall and spoke about how different this moment felt from the surprise encounter months earlier. There was no shock now, only presence. They recognized that what they were building required ongoing care, not dramatic gestures, and that understanding brought peace rather than disappointment. In the weeks that followed, Alina became more intentional about how she accepted opportunities. She asked herself whether each invitation supported the life she was creating or distracted from it. Daniel supported her decisions, reminding her that growth did not need to be loud to be real. His perspective helped her trust her instincts, especially when external voices suggested faster paths or greater exposure. Daniel also experienced changes in his own sense of direction. He began exploring interests he had long set aside and allowed himself to imagine possibilities without immediate answers. He told Alina that reconnecting with her had reminded him that life could hold more than survival and responsibility. It could also hold curiosity and hope. Alina listened with gratitude, knowing that the reunion had reshaped both of them in ways they were still discovering. They continued to meet regularly and maintained honest communication when life became busy. They did not demand constant updates or reassurance. They trusted the foundation they had built and allowed space without fear. This trust marked a turning point, because it showed that their bond no longer relied on proximity or constant confirmation. It rested on shared understanding. Alina noticed that when she played the piano now, she felt less divided between past and present. The music carried continuity. Rather than longing, she no longer played to recover something lost, but to express something alive. This shift brought a new depth to her performances, and she sensed that audiences responded to this wholeness, even if they could not name it. Daniel attended fewer performances, but remained deeply supportive. He told her that knowing she was playing mattered more than watching every moment. These words reinforced Alina's belief that connection did not require constant visibility. It required trust and respect. As the months unfolded, Alina felt ready to explore new musical directions. She began composing small pieces inspired by memory, reunion, and resilience. She shared early versions with Daniel, who listened attentively and offered reflections without critique. These exchanges strengthened her confidence and reminded her that creativity thrived best in safe, honest spaces. She reflected often on the moment she first saw him in the auditorium, and how that instant of astonishment had opened a path she never expected. She understood now that the power of that moment lay not in surprise, but in what followed: the choice to remain open to conversation, forgiveness, and patience. Alina moved forward with gratitude and clarity, carrying both her past and present with balance. She knew challenges would continue, and that uncertainty was part of any meaningful life. But she also knew she was no longer facing those uncertainties alone. The piano had brought her back to her brother, but more importantly, it had brought her back to herself, and that understanding gave her strength to continue shaping a future rooted in honesty, connection, and quiet courage. As Alina and Daniel continued forward, the rhythm of their relationship settled into something that felt natural and unforced. They no longer measured progress by how much they talked or how often they met. Instead, they noticed how steady the connection felt even during silence. This quiet confidence became a foundation that supported both of them as their individual lives continued to grow. Alina entered a season of deeper artistic focus. She was invited to prepare a longer program that required emotional range and personal interpretation. Rather than technical display, she welcomed the challenge because it allowed her to explore the kind of music that reflected her inner life. She practiced with patience, allowing ideas to develop slowly, and she found herself thinking less about audience reaction and more about honesty in sound. This shift made her work feel purposeful rather than demanding. Daniel followed her process from a distance through shared voice messages and occasional calls. He listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions that helped her clarify her intentions without steering them. He had learned that his role was not to guide, but to witness, and that awareness strengthened their bond. Alina felt supported without feeling observed, and that balance mattered deeply to her. During this time, Daniel faced a difficult decision in his own life related to work and long-term direction. He felt torn between stability and change, and shared his concerns with Alina. She listened quietly and reflected his thoughts back to him, helping him hear his own clarity rather than offering solutions. This mirrored the way music had helped her listen inwardly. And Daniel recognized that the support between them now moved in both directions. They decided to take a short trip together to a quiet rural area. Neither of them knew well the purpose was simple: to spend time without agenda or expectation. They walked along open paths, talked about small observations, and allowed silence to exist comfortably. Alina noticed how easily they shared space now without needing to fill it. And Daniel felt the same sense of ease that had been missing from many of his relationships. One evening during the trip, Alina brought a small keyboard she sometimes traveled with and played softly in the rented room. The music was unplanned and informal. Daniel sat nearby listening without speaking. The sound filled the space gently and reminded both of them of evenings long ago, when music was simply part of life, not a pursuit or a profession. When she finished, Daniel thanked her quietly and said the moment felt complete. Neither of them needed to explain why. As Alina prepared for her upcoming program, she reflected on how much her approach to music had changed. Since the reunion, she was no longer playing to resolve absence or prove resilience. She was playing to express presence. This realization brought calm and confidence. She trusted her instincts and allowed the program to evolve naturally rather than forcing a narrative. She felt aligned with her choices in a way she had not experienced before. Daniel attended the performance and sat near the back as he often did. He watched Alina move through the music with clarity and composure. The audience responded warmly, but what stood out to him was how grounded she seemed. He recognized that the strength in her playing came not from control, but from acceptance, and that understanding moved him deeply. After the performance, they met briefly and shared a quiet smile. There was no need for extended conversation, because the meaning had already been exchanged. Daniel told her later that the music felt like a conversation rather than a presentation. Alina received this with gratitude, knowing that it reflected the heart of what she was trying to offer. As weeks passed, Alina began mentoring a small group of students who struggled with confidence and expression. She did not speak openly about her personal story, but she guided them toward listening inwardly and trusting their emotional responses. Daniel noticed how this teaching mirrored her own growth and told her that she had become someone who created space rather than occupied it. Those words resonated deeply and affirmed her path. Daniel also made a significant decision during this period, choosing a new direction that allowed greater balance and fulfillment. He credited the clarity gained through reconnecting with Alina, and through observing her careful choices. He told her that watching her protect what mattered had given him permission to do the same. She listened with pride and humility, knowing that growth often spread quietly between people who shared trust. They continued to honor boundaries and independence. Neither expected the other to fill every role or meet every need. This mutual respect kept the relationship strong and prevented old fears from resurfacing. Alina felt free to pursue her music fully, and Daniel felt free to explore his own interests without comparison or pressure. Alina noticed that when challenges arose, she no longer felt alone. Even when Daniel was not immediately present, she carried a sense of connection that steadied her. This internal shift changed how she approached uncertainty. She trusted herself more and allowed setbacks to pass without defining her worth. Daniel experienced a similar transformation. He approached relationships with greater openness and less defensiveness. He felt more patient with himself and more willing to wait for clarity rather than forcing outcomes. He attributed this to the reconnection and to the shared understanding that meaningful change required time and care. As the year progressed, Alina and Daniel reflected occasionally on how unexpected their reunion had been and how gently it had reshaped their lives. They recognized that the astonishment of that first moment had given way to something deeper and more lasting: trust, presence, and shared growth. They understood that the real gift was not the surprise, but the willingness to remain open afterward. Together, they continued forward with quiet confidence, neither rushing nor holding back. They allowed their bond to evolve naturally, shaped by honesty, patience, and mutual respect. The piano remained a thread between them, not as a symbol of performance, but as a reminder of listening and presence. Alina felt grateful that her journey had led her not only to musical clarity, but to restored family connection. She knew now that strength did not come from standing alone, but from allowing support without losing independence. This understanding guided her choices and grounded her ambitions. Daniel felt the same gratitude, knowing that the courage to show up that day had opened a path he never expected. He no longer feared the past or avoided the future. He trusted the present and the steady connection they had built together. As they moved into what came next, Alina carried the knowledge that when she reached the piano, she was not defined by surprise or loss, but by the fullness of who she had become and the relationships she had chosen to rebuild with care and intention. As time continued to unfold, Alina and Daniel settled into a life that felt balanced and sincere, rather than dramatic or rushed. Their connection no longer felt like something newly repaired. It felt lived and shaped by trust, shared effort, and quiet understanding. They did not speak often about the moment of their reunion, Because it no longer defined them, what mattered was how naturally they now showed up for one another without obligation or fear. Alina moved forward in her musical life with a steady sense of purpose. She chose projects that allowed depth and meaning rather than constant visibility. Her performances became less frequent, but more intentional, and audiences responded to the honesty in her playing. She no longer measured success by recognition alone, but by how aligned she felt with the music she was creating. The piano had become a place of integration where her past, present, and future could exist together without conflict. Daniel continued shaping his own path with similar care. He made choices that supported balance and well-being rather than pressure. He found fulfillment in work that allowed him to be present and creative in smaller ways. And he remained closely connected to music as a listener, rather than a performer. He told Alina that music felt different now, not like a reminder of distance, but like a shared space that belonged to both of them. They kept their tradition of meeting occasionally in quiet places, sometimes to walk, sometimes to sit and talk, and sometimes simply to share silence. These moments did not need explanation. They were reminders that connection did not require constant action, only intention. They celebrated small milestones, supported one another during challenges, and allowed space when needed, trusting that the bond would remain steady. One meaningful moment came when Alina invited Daniel to hear a new composition she had written inspired by memory, reunion, and continuity. She played it privately without audience or expectation. Daniel listened fully, and when she finished, he said the piece felt like a bridge rather than a conclusion. Those words captured exactly what Alina had hoped to express. She realized then that her music had evolved into something that honored where she came from while remaining open to what lay ahead. Alina also noticed how her teaching had deepened. She guided students with empathy and patience, emphasizing self-trust rather than comparison. She understood now that music education was not only about skill, but about emotional permission. And she created spaces where students felt safe to explore without fear. Daniel occasionally attended these sessions, quietly observing, and later shared how meaningful it was to see her create for others what music had once given her. Daniel, in turn, became more open about his own experiences, and occasionally spoke at small gatherings about resilience and choice. He never centered himself as an example, but shared honestly about navigating uncertainty. Alina listened with pride, recognizing how far they had both come, not by erasing the past, but by learning from it. They eventually returned together once more to the city auditorium, where everything had shifted this time. The space felt familiar and calm rather than overwhelming. They stood on the stage briefly, without audience, and Alina touched the piano keys softly. Daniel stood nearby and listened. Neither spoke much because words were unnecessary. The moment felt complete, not as an ending, but as acknowledgement. As they left the hall, Alina reflected on how astonishment had turned into acceptance, and how surprise had given way to intention. She understood that the power of that first encounter lay not in coincidence, but encouraged the courage to remain open to conversation, forgiveness, and time. She carried this lesson into every part of her life, trusting that openness often led to the most meaningful change. Daniel shared similar thoughts, saying that choosing to show up that day had taught him that fear did not disappear before action, it followed it, and that waiting for certainty often meant missing connection. This insight guided him forward and strengthened his confidence in making thoughtful choices, even when outcomes were unclear. Their relationship no longer felt like something to protect. It felt resilient, shaped by honesty and respect. They allowed it to evolve naturally without pressure to define its future. This freedom made the bond stronger because it rested on choice rather than obligation. Alina continued to play the piano with renewed clarity, knowing that when she sat at the keys, she carried not only her own story, but the quiet strength of restored connection. She no longer felt alone in her history or her hope, and that sense of wholeness gave her confidence that extended beyond music. Daniel felt the same sense of grounding, knowing that the silence between them no longer meant distance. It meant trust. He no longer feared losing connection, because it was no longer fragile. It was lived and proven through time and care. As they moved forward, Alina and Daniel did not seek to close the story of their reunion. They allowed it to remain open, shaped by everyday moments, shared laughter, and quiet support. The piano remained a thread between them, not as a symbol of surprise, but as a reminder of listening, presence, and continuity. Alina knew now that reaching the piano that day had changed her life, not because of the audience or the performance, but because it reunited her with family and with herself. She carried that understanding into the future, grounded and unafraid, ready to continue her journey with honesty, connection, and quiet courage. Quiet courage.